But before COVID, you were set to speak at Georgia State University, and essentially, I mean, my understanding of it was asked to sign like a foreign loyalty pledge to Israel, and if you didn't, you would be disinvited. So, can you, for people that know nothing about what happened, can you explain what happened in February, your corresponding lawsuit, and now there's obviously an update with the lawsuit?
Yeah. So 28 states or so, and maybe more now, have these laws on the books, which is essentially for private contractors. So me as an independent contractor going and speaking at Georgia Southern University, that would be the same, let's say, as a construction worker. I know that these existed in Texas for hurricane relief funds, that you had to sign over a loyalty pledge to Israel in order to get funds and in order to work in the state of Texas. So it didn't matter if I was a substitute teacher or an independent contractor in construction, or in my case, speaking at a university. Ironically, Jordan, this was a conference for media literacy. It had nothing to do with Palestine. It had nothing to do with my pro-Palestine advocacy or my film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. I was simply to discuss the topic of media literacy. So it's just a hilarious kind of chain of events that in order to speak there, I was given this contract to say, I pledge that I will not boycott Israel now or at any point in my life in order to get the $1,000 honorarium that I had, that I was going to receive for speaking there. So of course, getting this contract, and I knew that these laws existed in the periphery. I had spoken about them on tour for our film, but to actually receive the contract myself was pretty shocking. I did not know that that was going to happen. So of course I said that I could not sign this. I knew that it was a direct violation of my constitutional rights, namely my First Amendment right of free speech and the right to participate in political boycotts. This is something that was granted by the Supreme Court back in the 80s on the heels of the civil rights movement. So, you know, I couldn't comply with the request to say that I could never boycott Israel. I've been advocating the boycott of Israel for my entire journalistic career. So yeah, Jordan, I declined that contract. The entire conference ended up falling apart because in the background, the organizers were arguing amongst themselves, and some had taken my side and they said, we don't want to go through with this if you're going to knock Abby off as the keynote speaker because she refuses to sign this pledge. So the entire conference fell apart. There was actually a notice on the website saying this is canceled until further notice. And once I told my story, I was contacted by CARE about the initiation of a lawsuit against the state of Georgia. These laws have been challenged in, I think, 3 states, and there have been different outcomes for each one. It might go to the Supreme Court. It depends on what the outcome is, but I decided to legally challenge this back in March. We had a big press conference in Georgia with CARE and my other attorney from the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, Marv Hayden Hilliard. Amazing attorneys. I'm so thankful that they're representing me. And I think we have a really good case because this is a flagrant violation of the US Constitution. And you even have Netanyahu and Israeli consulate, Israeli government officials admitting openly that they have, in a direct, blatant act of foreign interference, Jordan, as we're hearing liberals bemoan about Russia constantly, in a direct act of foreign interference, you have Israeli government officials admitting that they have been responsible for pushing these laws across the country. So that's where we're at right now. And I could talk about what has happened lately, which is why this case is now relevant again, which is right before the pandemic hit. Because I initiated this lawsuit, Georgia state legislature officials actually brought an Israeli government official to the state legislature and talked to them about crushing my case, which is trying to take the $1,000 honorarium, which would have triggered this contract to any state contractors or independent contractors working in the state, to now upping it to $100,000 to basically make the case moot and make it much more difficult for people to challenge the law. Because if you're making a $100,000 contract, you're much less likely to say, okay, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna forfeit this money because of my, because it's a violation of my constitution and my political free speech. So it's just outrageous that these laws are on the books. I think Americans would be really, really shocked to learn that these laws exist, especially when we hear so much nonsense about, again, foreign interference that really just comes down to something like Facebook ads, when you literally have government officials pushing laws, threatening economic consequences if we don't comply to loyalty oaths for their countries.
And what I find really interesting is, we know like DC, APAC, on the national level, Israel has always had a stranglehold over our national politics. But the fact that this is now spreading to local areas and states, it's like, I don't know, first thing I think about with Georgia isn't like hardcore love for Zionism and Israel. Mm-hmm. So can you kind of give insight in why has the kind of federal stranglehold that Israel has through AIPAC and other, why is it spread to the point where Georgia and these other states would be basically trying to, suppress dissent?
Yeah, and just as a thought experiment, just like think about literally any other country doing this, right? Bringing, let's say, like a Russian or Iranian government official, or even like a Canadian official to your state legislature, being like, hey, we're working with this government to actually try to push these laws through. Like, they've asked us to do this, so that this is what we're going to do. I mean, it's just absolutely surreal and Orwellian, frankly, to kind of take yourself out of the scenario and really replace Israel with any other country. And I think it just speaks to this bizarre alliance and allegiance that has been bipartisan, right? And even Joe Biden himself said that if Israel didn't exist, the U.S. would have to create one, essentially as the U.S. empire's battering ram and gas station in the country when it's carrying out military operations. So it's fascinating that this has been able to happen. As to your question about how has this happened on a state-by-state level, Netanyahu himself said that they have been working locally. I mean, this is an effort to work locally, especially in light of the Trump administration's efforts to suppress pro-Palestine speech on college campuses, because they understand the threat that BDS poses on a local level. This is something that's erupting on college campuses across the country. And this is obviously the biggest threat to Israel on an international level, this international pressure that is mounting around the world, really, to hold Israel accountable for its crimes and atrocities against the Palestinian people. So it erupts on college campuses here. You see a lot of divestment efforts on college campuses here that are successful, frankly, and are causing waves. And that is scaring the Israeli government. And you saw the Trump administration take power, and they had been the biggest friend to Israel that Israel has ever had. You saw Netanyahu campaigning on, basically his friendship with Trump. Trump's son, Jared Kushner, profiting personally on his illegal settlement expansion. They even have a house where a room is dedicated to Netanyahu when he comes to visit them. So it's pretty crazy stuff. But that's where you saw this kind of forging partnership where they really zeroed in on these college campuses. And that's where, Trump himself talked about this attempt. I'm not sure if it was an executive order or not, but he has talked about this a lot, and I'm pretty sure that he passed some sort of legislation that essentially says that if you're going to boycott Israel or initiate some sort of BDS movement, like you will forfeit like your potential job prospects and stuff. It's defaming college students and pro-Palestine activists in a really malicious way. So this has been something that they have been working together, and I think that you've seen these states pass these anti-BDS resolutions more frequently in the wake of the Trump administration. But I think going state to state is an obvious it's an obvious way to just kind of slip this by, because they all frame this, Jordan, in kind of anti-Semitism and hate speech and stuff like that. And I think a lot of these people just don't think twice about it, like in the case of the Georgia law. I mean, it seemed like they didn't even understand how absurd it was. They were just talking about bringing an Israeli consulate official with them to, change the law, so make my case moot. I think they honestly just don't think twice. And because they framed it in this language of hate against Jewish people, frankly, it's really muddied the issue and made people not really aware of what a violation it really is and how it really is a notion of free speech. And that's why you see actually Jewish organizations like Trua, an organization of rabbis, and also J Street, which is a very, very influential lobbying organization on the Hill. They have actually signed amicus briefs filed on behalf of support for my lawsuit, because they understand that even if they don't support BDS, right, as a concept, they understand what a direct violation of BDS, anti-BDS laws rather, are on our free speech rights.
And I'll also say, I'd love to get your thoughts. Maybe you have insight into it, but like you said, you were set to speak at a media conference. This wasn't about Israel. You're somebody who's reported extensively in Gaza. You've done this great documentary. So to me, I don't know, it seems like someone like you with a big following would be on the Israeli government's radar. So I don't know, it just seems odd to me that you're going to speak at a conference about media and all of a sudden this foreign loyalty oath comes out. Do you have any insight whether, I mean, hopefully they're not monitoring you at all times, but that Netanyahu's government, his press operation, whatever, was tipped off to the fact that, you were speaking and that's why they reached out?
I know that I'm on their radar. That's been back since Operation Pillar of Cloud when I was at RT, that they took notice of my coverage and said RT had taken a side in the Gaza massacre that they were employing at the time after they bombed a journalist tower, the Al Sharoof journalist tower, and blew an RT journalist's leg off. So back then they already had taken notice of my coverage. And then of course it got more extreme when we were in the West Bank doing reporting for Empire Files, and we tried to get into Gaza. And we were told by Israeli's press ministry that I was a propagandist and also an Iranian enemy agent. I was surprised to be called an Iranian agent. I'm used to being called a Russian agent or a Venezuelan agent. So that was frankly startling and scary, to be within Israel proper and actually be deemed like an enemy agent of Israel. I don't think I'll be welcomed back in the country. But as far as this clause, Jordan, that's what's so fascinating about it. It is triggered simply if anyone wants to work in the state of Georgia and has signed a contract for over $1,000. And I think that the vast majority of people are just forfeiting their constitutional rights to work, right? And without really thinking twice about it. And the only reason that I obviously took notice of it is because I was aware of these laws and, read the contract, read the language, and I was totally startled and taken back that this language was included, and simply a clause in the overall contract of me signing to speak, right? It wasn't a separate contract that said, here, by the way, here's your loyalty pledge. So I could see how people would completely pass over this without giving it a second thought. And in fact, the majority of people do when they work not only in this state, but like I said, 27 states across the country.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.